Those kids that you saw up there, did you notice that in the first half, those are kids that needed adopting and they have been adopted? And absolutely, yeah. They happen to be kids that have been adopted by Bethel people. And by the way, that reminds me, I'm supposed to say there's a table out there about Bethel College and Seminary, which is really a wonderful place for all sorts of reasons. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, there's a table out there. So those kids happen to have been adopted by people at Bethel. Now I know lots of you are either adopted or are in the process or have adopted children. And I think that's wonderful. That's an inspiration. But in the second half of the video, there was these children. Did you see that one girl in particular with the most amazing eyes? It was kind of just beaming. And I love to watch those last few pictures. There are children out there. They're all beautiful children. And they're the direct result, or their situation, of needing to get a life, really. I don't mean biological life. I mean the kind of life that our Creator has in mind for them. There are children out there who are in that situation as a result of the world's idolatry. You've heard Greg say a lot lately about kingdom consciousness. Kingdom consciousness. I sometimes use the word creational living, by which I mean living that is actually in tune with what the Creator has in mind. Call it kingdom consciousness, call it creational living, call it authentic life. There are kids out there who are struggling because they do not have one of the main conditions for human life, or creational, authentic life. And that is to be part of a community, a family, or even a wider community of people who are empowered by the very Spirit of God who created us in the first place. So, yeah, I will be talking about this a bit today. Please don't think this has got nothing to do with you because you're too old, you don't have enough money to adopt. Actually, some adoptions don't cost anything. Please don't just tune off at this point. This should matter the world to you, quite literally. And what I want to do now is just talk a little bit on why that is so. Okay, I've called this Some Dance to Remember, Some Dance to Forget, Provocative Thoughts about the Waiting Children of this World. And the reason I called it that is because some years ago, I was in Romania, the years 1990. I was in a place called Carpathia, which is, apparently the area where Dracula lives, all those nice castles and so on. And I was sitting in a train going from one place to another. Those were the last days of the Ceausescu regime, or just after that. Security police were still around everywhere, trailing you, and you tried to get rid of them. You stayed on one train that went to a different destination long enough to just wait for the next train to depart. You ran across, you jumped on, and you tried to lose the security police. It was those days. It was oppressive. But here's what's strange about that train journey. I went into the train, a big long train. It was going to travel for 6 hours. I was the only guy in that train, at least for the first few minutes. And then somebody came in. This guy comes in, and he could have been security police. I don't know. He was actually wearing a uniform, which they don't normally do, but he was wearing a uniform, and he didn't look, his uniform was all sort of torn and so on. Romania is still a poor country. It was very much a poor country at the time. And he chose to sit right opposite of me. There's no one else in the train, so he's sitting there. Okay, so I'm suffering from a sense of just security police phobia. This guy is sitting opposite me. He just grins at me the whole time. We've got 6 hours of this. To this day, I don't know if he was security police or not. To make matters more interesting, my wife had asked me to read Frank Peretti's This Present Darkness. She wanted an opinion on it. I'm looking out the window. There are military police out there because they need to guard that rail track because it's one of the only ones that go to the north of the country. So as the train goes past, they kind of train their machine guns on you. On the other hand, looking out the window, there's this beautiful creation that God has given us. Wonderful countryside out there. Amazing. And yet, every now and then, we pass a little village with evidence of complete poverty. And I'm sitting there trying to make sense of how it could be that on the one hand, God gives us this wonderful creation, and he wants us to live in it with the kind of kingdom consciousness that Greg's been talking about lately. On the other hand, we have actually turned it into something that is, that has evidence of idolatry all over the place. Selfishness, self-obsession, greed, wrong priorities. And those children, especially the ones you saw in the second half there, and millions of others, are the direct result of those wrong priorities in this world. God's creation, kingdom consciousness on the one side, the world's priorities, idolatry on the other side. That's the context here. And I was sitting in the train and I was thinking back a few days. Just a few days earlier, I'd been to an orphanage. One of my students was director of an orphanage there. And I looked around and there were these kids, and some of them were sort of rocking back and forth, and others were walking in certain patterns. And like a fool, I asked him, I said, what are they doing? Are they not the ones that were sort of rocking, but the ones that were walking around? What are they doing? Are they playing a game or something? Here's what he said. He said they are walking to the rhythm of pathology and desperation. Some dance to remember, and some dance to forget. So I'm sitting in this train thinking about this, and suddenly it hit me. This is Hotel California, right? Eagles? If you're too young to know the live version of Hotel California, you shouldn't be here. We've got provision for you. That is an amazing song. Don Henley kind of has a go at all sorts of things that he thinks are wrong, with the world, especially, presumably, California at the time. He has a go as capitalism. Tiffany, our mind is Tiffany twisted. We've got the Mercedes-Benz. He has to go possibly at prostitution in there with a hotel, though I'm not sure about that. He mentions the Colitas, the drug reference in there. What Don Henley understands is that the world has a problem. And I'm saying to you that these children, and not just these children, but also these children, are clear evidence that the world has a problem. We need to explore this a little bit, and you can see some Bible references here and there. I won't actually spend time talking about them specifically. I want to do more an overview kind of thing. What are the main issues here, rather than to delve deeply into a Bible text, which is, what I usually do. So let's explore this a little bit. How do we make sense of this tension of God's good creation on the one hand, and our fight, our temptation to be swept along by the world's idolatry on the other hand? I suggest to you that we need and I don't care particularly what you call it, but we need something like a biblical way of thinking. Call it a biblical theology, or like I said, a biblical way of thinking, whatever word you want to use. We need some way of moving from the Bible as God's word to this situation that is intolerable. We need to ask whether we're ready to be used as God's primary tool, a tool of recovery in this fallen world. And we need to ask specifically whether we're ready to do that, for instance, for the world's waiting children. So I think we need a biblical theology of adoption. And if you look this up, if say you take a theological dictionary, okay, if you have one of those at home, you look up adoption, you will find a lot of information about God adopting us. And that is the heart of why we're here. But you will find practically nothing about how we are supposed to take that into the world and adopt people ourselves. Not just children, but also children. We need a biblical theology of child adoption partly because none exists. And that, to me, is an astonishing situation. If it is true that these children and the people who, turn up in our shelters and the people who ask for food and so on, if it is true that at least to an extent they are evidence of the world's idolatry, whatever the individual situations may be, and they're usually pretty complex, if that is true, we need a response to that. And I want to talk a little bit about how we could do that. And basically, what I'm aiming for is to say, we shouldn't be asking, why on earth would God want me to adopt a child or any other person? I'll be talking about children, but it goes for anyone. We shouldn't be asking, what reasons could there possibly be for that? We should be asking, what reasons could there possibly be why I shouldn't be doing that? Do you see what I mean? We should assume that because God adopted us, we too should be adopting others. Let's start with the grand story. Biblically, there is a grand story. There's a big scheme. There is something that determines everybody's life. Now, we live in a time that's called postmodernity, and at heart that means if you're postmodern, you basically deny that there is such a grand story that applies to everyone. You kind of make your own story, as it were. We're not going to go into that. But the Bible, I think, is quite clear. There is a story between God and his creation that is determinative for everyone. Our choice is to live under that story, the life of the world or the life of kingdom consciousness. There are three main aspects to that story that I want to highlight to you. Number one, there's only one God. Only one God. That is unpopular. It was unpopular in antiquity. It's unpopular still today. People often want to argue there are all sorts of gods. The Bible insists there's just one. The Bible also insists that that one God created us. And again, a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. There are philosophies and worldviews and so on out there that are based on the assumption that all things physical, including our bodies, are kind of bad, negative. There are religions out there that are predicated on the assumption that to escape from our bodies is redemption. In fact, astonishingly, there are lots of Christians who think like that. And yet the Bible is creation affirming. So there's one God, a God who created us, and finally a God who even after the fall remains committed to us. That means that this God has decided he's going to work hard to recover this fallen creation. If you want a text for that, you've got some on the screen there, Genesis 1, John 1. If you know the New Testament well, find Romans, go to Romans 8. God God is passionate about regaining creation, about reclaiming it. And the reasons are because he is the only God who created us, and he's not going to walk away from this situation. As Christians, we may be tempted to often, and we in fact do it, but we shouldn't. How does this work out in history? Well, just very briefly. Israel, if you read the Old Testament, you find that God picks a people for himself, and he says to that people, and it happens to be Israel, he says, I want you to advertise to the world what true life is about. Because you cannot really talk to the world about true life and expect anyone to understand. Talking, and even though I'm doing it here, is probably that's purely because of numbers. Talking as kind of one-way traffic is one of the worst ways of communicating. The best way of communicating is to live out a story before people that they can see. This is why we read stories to our kids, when we put them to bed at night. Because stories are powerful. and people connect. So God picks a people, they're Israel, and he says, I want you to be my model humanity. I sometimes use the phrase project humanity, whatever. This is the model humanity. It's like God saying, I want you to live according to my wishes so that the world will look on and say, that's what we need. That's where we need to go. Did Israel succeed in doing that? Well, no. We read in the Old Testament of failure all the time. But there is one who did succeed on Israel's behalf, Jesus. And that is the reason why Jesus is the only hope that this fallen world has. Jesus embodies, he represents, he lives out what it means to be truly human. Not human on 2 cylinders, assuming your car is 6 or 8 or something like that. Not human on 2 cylinders, truly human. Human as God wants it, as the Creator encourages us to be. Jesus is the one who actually takes the task that Israel had, and he succeeded. People said at the time he failed, but it was in his failure that he succeeded, in his apparent failure. It was not failure. He did the sacrificial thing. He died for the world. Israel was supposed to exist for the benefit of the world. Jesus supremely existed and still does for the benefit of the world, and so should we. On that, I picked up this Bethel brochure out there, and it says on here, taking the next step to change the world. I used to hate that kind of stuff. It just sounds too grand, grandiose, and so on. But actually, if we do not exist to change the world into a kingdom consciousness, into a place, a space where people can live authentically, including those kids, then why are we here in the first place? And why do we often live as if we were only here to be saved individually now, and then we kind of wait and keep on living the way we've always lived, and then after death it's going to pay off that we decided to live with Jesus, or decided in favor of Jesus? How can that be? Jesus is the one who lives out the true life in front of our eyes, a life that is sacrificial, a life that he is prepared to give for others. And the radical thing here is that he expects us to do the same. Think Acts, a book in the New Testament, right after the Gospels in terms of the proper sequencing, as it were. In Acts, they are the first Christians. They do radical stuff. They practically own everything together at that point. And sometimes I have students who come to me and say, come on, that must have been the exception. It's a little over the top, they're a little enthusiastic and so on. Well, no, the simple fact is, because there was need, material need in that particular case, it stood to reason for Christians to share everything in that situation. And they did that because of Jesus' self-sacrifice. And in principle, we are required to do the same thing. Jesus died for us to take away our sin, but more than that, he died for us and rose to life because he wants us to live out the example of his life. So we have Israel, we have Jesus kind of in the middle of history, as it were. Israel first, Old Testament, then we have Jesus in the Gospels. And then we have the church, the Christian church. Jesus decided that he had to take Israel's mission and task and actually live it out, because Israel itself was incapable of doing that. Now, here's the problem that we sometimes face. As Christians, as Christian churches, Christian communities, as Christians who sometimes live together, sometimes not. Some of us are more in the world, which is wonderful because that's where we need to be. Some of us retreat from the world and say it's evil. Well, that's a bit more problematic. Christians and as churches, we so often are tempted to read the Bible and to point at Israel and say, you know what? You failed at every turn. And yet, we too so often fail. And we have the big advantage of living after Jesus. We actually have the big advantage of Jesus being present with us through the Spirit in a way that was not true at the time of the Old Testament. We should not be pointing the finger. We should be thinking about our own lifestyles and how radical we need to be to live out the story of Jesus in front of the world. That's the whole point of the church. The church, or the churches, wherever they are essentially God's wisdom challenge to the world. That is our purpose. Our purpose as churches is not to have our weekly festivals primarily, though I love the weekly festival. Our purpose as church is to live in the world and to illustrate to the world what kind of life can be had and can be lived if only we are in tune with the Creator. It's about reminding the world that there is a Creator. Remember the big story at the beginning we started off with? It's about reminding the world that that Creator did not leave the world behind. No left behind there. Sorry. It is a God who remains committed to his creation. And his chosen way of letting the world know about that is for us to live it out. This is, at the end of the day, why we cannot just say, God adopted us, thank you very much. We need to say, God adopted us, thank you very much, and now we're going to adopt others to actually complete the story. The church as God's wisdom challenge. Now, the way Jesus lived out his fulfillment of what it really means to be truly human, the way that God wants us to live, the way he did that was subversive. Subversive is sometimes a bit of a negative term, kind of rebellious. Well, he was. And subversive can also be a very positive thing. We need to be subversive. The question is, subversive of what? Subversive of the idolatry and the wrong priorities of this world. Jesus lived that out. Not because he said the world is evil and I'm going to walk away, but because he said the world is idolatrous and my task is to regain as many as I can in God's good creation. Jesus died on the cross on our behalf. The fallen humanity had to die. So Jesus takes it upon himself. He dies on the cross. He then is raised from the dead. He experiences, or he's raised to full life that we don't even know yet. And he, Acts 1 tells us, he ascended, which is another way of saying he is confirmed. He is confirmed. That's how they would have understood it at the time. He is confirmed as God's only hope for this world. But each of those three things, his death and his resurrection and the ascension, those three things are not enough. Each of them is wonderful, a wonderful display of God's love for the world. But we need the fourth component. And the fourth component is what's called, the Bible calls it, or we also often call it Pentecost. The pouring out of the Spirit. If you turn to Acts, you don't need to do this now, but the book called Acts of the Apostle in the New Testament, apostles plural, in chapter 2 you can read what I'm talking about. Jesus died and rose and ascended to be even more powerfully present with us after his departure. In fact, it would be a mistake to think of Jesus' ascension as departure. He's gone. In one way, he's gone, but only to be back more powerfully. I don't know if you've ever thought about Pentecost as the sort of the pinnacle of a sequence of things that Jesus did for us. We've got to think about it in that way. It's a shame if we stop with a cross. And even if we go to the resurrection, we shouldn't feel too good at that point, because we need even more than that. We need death and resurrection and confirmation. Ascension, in other words. But we need Jesus' ascension in order to understand that at Pentecost, in Acts 2, he became present with us more powerfully than ever before. I don't know if you've heard people say things like, Christians saying things like, it would be wonderful to have lived at the time of Jesus, to have walked with him. But the reality of the situation is the disciples who did walk with him, they failed at every turn. Read Mark's gospel and find a single instance of the disciples not failing, other than deciding to follow him in the first place, which is amazing, and picking up that donkey in Jerusalem. There's nothing. It's true. Prove me wrong. Read it, come back to. Actually, there's one case where they come back and they say they've done great things, but actually they're arrogant even at that point. It seems much better, biblically, to say that because Jesus is back with us through the Spirit, and that's what Pentecost is about. It seems much better, therefore, to say that we have the best chance compared to Israel, and even compared to the disciples, actually to live out the story of what true life means. We're in a better position. Pentecost is the pinnacle of what I call it the Christ event. I'm a foreigner, I use strange terms and so on, but the whole package, the Christ package, death, resurrection, ascension, Pentecost. Pentecost is the pinnacle. But then what exactly is the role of the Spirit, if that is true? Well, number one is the role of the Spirit is to remind us of the continued presence of God and the continued commitment of God to his creation. God has not checked out of this creation and is gone. That kind of thinking, which is so prevalent in Christian circles, I call it spaceship theology. Okay, this is bad, let's wait for the spaceship that takes us away to a better place. I assure you, nobody in the first century, and the New Testament was written for those people, would have conceived of creation as something we need to escape from. It needs to be regained rather than gotten rid of. Yes, there is language in the Bible, I know that talks about creation, the destruction of creation, but actually those passages are about the destruction of the wrong sort of life in this creation. The Bible is creation affirming. I know that years ago I used to think that when Christians were interested in environmental matters, they must be left-wing. Well, actually, they got something that took me years to get. The Bible and the God of the Bible are creation affirming. So, what else does the Spirit do for us? The Spirit sponsors the kind of life that God actually wants us to lead, not so that we feel good, but that others say, can I have some of that? There's a movie involving Meg Ryan where somebody uses that phrase, I'll have some of that. You know what I mean? If you don't worry about it. I won't give you any more details. That's how we need to live, so that other people say, I'll have some of that. And that's what the Spirit is about. What else? The Spirit is about pushing us beyond religious observance. Some months ago, Sandra Unger and Paul Eddy preached here. Some of you will have been there, I suppose. And Sandra made this, she referred to me rather outrageously as an egghead. I don't know even if she's here today, but I thought, you are here. Bummer. I mean, I was going to get pictures ready showing you at your graduation, as you're kind of strutting across the stage, and being all egg-headish. And myself in an excavator digging foundations for the house we're building. And I was going to ask you what egghead actually means, because it's not my language. But until yesterday, at least, I thought you would not be here today. So you got away with that. That's a shame. I'll get you some other time. We need to be pushed beyond religious observance. And one of the things you guys were talking about at the time was church is not something you can go to. If you go to whatever it is, that something cannot possibly be church. It can be religious observation. It can be good religious observation. It can be a great festival. It's just not church. The Spirit is there to push us beyond the religious observation, to push us into radical lifestyle choices. The Spirit is there also to overcome what I've come to call graded holiness. You know that view that basically says some people are sort of at the center of God's kingdom and then it goes outwards. We might call them pastors or reverends or whatever. And then it kind of goes out, and some of us, we're kind of way out here, and when we defer to them and we rely on them, that they do the teaching for us and they read the Bible for us and all the rest of it, and they exhort us, but not too much, a little bit, and so on. And we expect them when we're in trouble over here, like we're sick or something, we expect somebody close to the center to come over and visit us, because otherwise we haven't been visited. That is graded holiness, and Jesus made it his business to blow it out of the water. So those are some of the things that we need to be aware of in terms of Pentecost being the pinnacle of the Christ package. So, what about the world's waiting children that you saw up there earlier? Well, it seems to me we don't even have a choice. I don't think this is one of those glib lifestyle choices. Shall I buy a Mercedes-Benz, this time with a Z at the end, or a Beamer, or a Cadillac, or a Chevy, or whatever? It's not one of those choices. Adoption is not one of those choices. Who cares what car you drive? Other than yourself, presumably. But this goes deeper. The question of the world's waiting children goes a lot deeper. I don't think we have an option. I don't think we should say to God, God, if you want to, persuade me, miraculously, that I should be doing something in that area. If anything, we have to say to God, if I'm honest, I don't think I can do anything about it, so give me something else. That is how we often approach lifestyle choices. But what we should be saying is, God, we are ready to be used as your recovery tool, because we understand that you remain committed to your creation. You haven't given up from it. You haven't walked out. Jesus, you have never been the escapist. So please help us through your Spirit that we too would not be escapists in the face of very serious issues in this world. Adoption is in a sense, it's about incorporation. It's about bringing people into the sort of humanity that God wants for them. God incorporated us. That's why the New Testament often talks about us being in Christ. And the whole point is that the way we are in Christ, the way we behave, would be like an advertisement, an ad to the world to say, join us, be incorporated as well. We can only do that out there in the world. We cannot expect people to come in here and learn new vocabulary and give mental assent. It goes deeper than that. Here's my argument. Adoption is a condition, a precondition of true life, period. We all need to be adopted. There is no true life apart from being adopted. But not only being adopted by God, but adopted into God's community. I think it's a shame if we take the word adoption and we apply it only to what God did with us, or when we adopt children rather than having biological children. Every single person in this room at some point was or is a biological child, but every single person in this room needs to be adopted, not only by God, but by people. It is no good to any of us to have biological parents if for whatever reason, and these are complex, difficult issues, if for whatever reason those biological parents of ours have been unable to adopt us. Everybody needs adoption, not just those kids. For adoption is a condition of true life. It's also another word for restoration. Adoption means restoration. So what's holding us back? I just want to mention a couple of things. I think our obsession with ourselves is often holding us back. We live in a world and in a society, and by the way, I come from Europe. I'm not having a go at your society here. For me, the national thing is pretty unimportant anyway. But in the West, whether it's here or the other side of the ocean, in the West, we are obsessed with ourselves. We are obsessed with getting more beautiful. We're obsessed with improving ourselves. We're obsessed with advancing our cause, whatever that may be. We're obsessed with reproducing ourselves. That makes it very difficult for the world's waiting children. It makes it difficult for anyone who needs to be adopted because we're too busy with ourselves. Here's another thing that I think often holds us back. And by the way, I know I'm sounding negative here. Greg used the phrase, he asked, "Are we awake?" This is about asking, are we awake? So, if it sounds too negative, forgive me. The underlying thrust of what I'm saying is very positive. We need to awake to make a positive contribution in the world. Something else that often holds us back, seems to me, is our propensity, even as Christians, to defend our chosen lifestyles no matter what. Sometimes I hear Christians speak and see them write about life as if God's number one priority had to be to defend our chosen lifestyle. That is tempting, but I cannot find any of that in the Bible. And you might say, but you don't find cars in the Bible either. Well, that is not the point. The point is this kind of thinking that it is God's major task to defend our chosen lifestyle, that is in direct conflict with God's mandate for us and God's empowering of us through the Spirit, both of which say, live for the world. And our chosen lifestyle, which is very nice, is secondary to that. And if we don't think so, then my question would be, are we even understanding the gospel? There are other things that I think hold us back. I don't want to go into too many details, but we can be so selective, for instance, in our understanding of salvation. And that can take various forms. One temptation is to think that salvation it's about God and me. That's it. Okay, and if my spouse also gets saved, that's wonderful. That's between God and my spouse, and indirectly about us because, we're married. Well, salvation is not about God and me, period. Salvation is about God and me as I am part of a community. More than that, salvation is about God and me as I am part of a community that at this point exists solely to glorify God by helping with the project recovery, the project regaining creation, the project humanity, call it what you want to call it. That is the full purpose. Another way of being selective is if we say salvation, well, I've been converted, thank God. Oh, absolutely, I agree. That is crucial. But if we stop there and then kind of pretend as though we're in this Christian waiting room, looking at pictures of the kingdom, and kind of thinking, well, hey, when my day comes and I die, I'm going to be saved. I'm going to fly away. That is also deeply selective. It reduces the core of the gospel to something that is now so small, it gets close to being a perversion of the gospel. Those things about God saving me as an individual and my future after death are important things, but they're only part of the gospel. They're only part of what salvation means. But it does seem to me that some of those misunderstandings are holding us back. Sometimes we use them actively to support our use a big word here, quietism, our kind of keeping quiet in the face of evil, when God has empowered us to confront evil in this world. Not by attacking it, but by living out the alternative life, the life that is authentic. That is the life that God actually has in mind for people. Now, as applied to children, there are often, I hear excuses that I don't think work, but I hear them a lot where people say, whoa, you're too direct. And I know many of you are thinking that now. I'd be surprised if you didn't. This is too direct. This is too forceful. You're telling us we should basically adopt children, adopt people in the world, and so on. And maybe that God doesn't have that in mind for me. Well, I can tell you that people have said to me that God chooses before the creation of the world that some people will go to heaven and some people will go to hell, and some will have a good life and some will have a bad life. That is a deep, deep misunderstanding of certain biblical texts. It certainly should not be used as an excuse for being quiet and saying, keep warm and be well fed and see ya. We have other excuses that I also think don't work. I don't want to go through them. But it seems to me that that kind of approach that I just mentioned, God chooses some people to go this way and some people to go that way. If you want the technical term, it's a predestinarian approach. Mr. Miller goes to heaven, Mrs. Smith goes to hell, and God decided that before. And sorry if you have those names. It's sheer coincidence. That God decided that before even creating the world. It's a deep misunderstanding. I think it's Christianese for fate. We're basically saying what a lot of non-Christians are also saying, but we dress it up in Christian language and say it's predestiny. The Bible, by the way, talks explicitly about predestiny, but that is not what it has in mind. Now, I do know that there are many here who will disagree with me, and we can talk. So I have an issue here with our what I call armchair theology. You sit back on your recliner, you read the Bible, and you give it this romantic kind of reading. Jesus, isn't he wonderful with his big heart? He is. His heart was big enough to die for me in the most gruesome way imaginable. But that has consequences for how I need to live. And I personally, I have to tell you, still need to work through that. And will have to do so for the rest of my life, I'm sure. So those children, I think we need to do something about them. It doesn't work to say, God gave me my own children biologically, and there are others who take care of the waiting children. We can turn something that is good and wonderful, namely biological procreation, we can turn that quite easily into an idolatry. Notice how sometimes we're tempted to say, God gave me my own children. What defines own here? Often it's biology. People who have adopted children And people who, the same people who also had biological children will not usually make that distinction. And in any case, the point of procreation is not to reproduce our fallen selves. The point is to help regain this fallen creation for God. And that is true of any parenting and any relationship in life that we might have. Well, I mentioned to you Hotel California earlier, and there's some amazing phrases in there. And I know that Don Henley did not have in mind what I have in mind here. At least I assume that. But think about it. Welcome to Hotel California. Such a lovely place. Such a lovely face. Plenty of room at the Hotel California. Any time of year you can find it here. Her mind is Tiffany twisted. She's got the Mercedes-Benz. She's got pretty boys that she calls friends. How they dance in the courtyard. Sweet summer sweat. Some dance to remember. Some dance to forget. That's where that phrase came from in the orphanage. That guy knew the live version of Hotel California out there in Romania. Last thing I remember, I was running for the door. I had to find the passage back to the place I was before. Relax, said the nightman. We are programmed to receive. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. The world's waiting children live in Hotel California. Their life could be heaven, but often it's hell. Our minds are often Tiffany twisted and have the Mercedes-Benz, while they dance to remember and dance to forget. They can grow up anytime, but will they ever live? Relax, said the nightman. We are programmed to receive. Here's my question for you, very simple. Are you programmed to receive? Because we should be. Or only to be received? This is how it feels to be free, it says in that song. God received us in order to program us to receive others. Relax, said the nightman. Well, actually, let's not relax. Let's set the agenda for the world by living creationally, by living for others, by living sacrificially. By the way, if you need to be received by the sponsor of true life, the only God who created us and who remains committed to us, you may want to come to the front while the song is playing in the background and talk to some people here about that. And if you're programmed to receive and you want to talk a little bit more about adoption, I'll be hanging out a bit here and we can do that. Relax, said the nightman, according to Don Henley. We shouldn't relax. We should go to places and tell the world to join us there. And one of those places is to recover people who are leading a life that is on the wrong track. Good news needs to be lived out, otherwise it becomes an idolatry. Think about it, please. Thanks for listening. God bless.